Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name's Jeff, and you're listening to episode 18 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello, and thanks for joining me again today. Welcome to another episode of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. My name's Jeff, and let's jump right in. Today's Comic Book of the Day is Virus number 1. This is from December of 1992, and it's published by Dark Horse Comics. This is a pretty decent comic book. If you take a look at it over on the website, you'll notice, I think, first off, the cover is particularly striking. If I remember correctly, this is another comic that I purchased at the time, and I've had with me the entire time that I've had my collection. So this isn't something that I went back and repurchased later. I think I've had this comic book since 1992, and it's one of a small number of those comics. I think if I had to go through my collection and kind of pick out all of the consistent books that I've sort of kept throughout my entire collecting life, as it were, I think it would be probably about a short box of comics that have sort of remained in my collection. And it's some good ones. I mean, it's some good ones and some arguably some probably not so good ones. This is a little bit of the latter and probably not so much of the former, but I don't know, man. For some reason, I just can't find the will to sort of get rid of it or throw it away or toss it. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's sort of my completionist attitude towards comics where, you know, if you have a 4-issue limited miniseries and you've got all 4 of those books, you kind of covet that little complete miniseries run or whatever it is, or if it's just the fact that all 4 of these covers are particularly striking in the way that they're designed and illustrated, or I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe I just have a soft spot for Dark Horse Comics. I think that's probably more true than I would let on. I do really, I think of all the independent comic book publishers, and when I think independent, I'm thinking of things like Comico and Dark Horse and Defiant and, you know, all kinds of Mirage Studios, you know, all kinds of little small independent presses. And I don't know necessarily that Dark Horse would be considered a small independent press anymore, but at the time they were. There was a time when, you know, Dark Horse sort of represented the outsider. They sort of represented the little guy, you know, that was sort of built out of, I think it was Mike Richardson's comic book shop at the time, started publishing Concrete, and then started with the Dark Horse Presents line, which was a terrific anthology series at the time. I remember it was sort of akin to, at the time, this was, you know, I was living in Seattle during the late 80s, early 90s, early 90s, late 80s. And this is just about the time that I had moved away from Seattle. But my familiarity with comics at the time and my collecting habits at the time and my reading habits at the time were all sort of influenced by my somewhat younger age, my somewhat rebellious attitude, and my somewhat affinity for alternative at the time. So I think, you know, at the time I was living in Seattle, so I was, you know, sporting the flannel shirt and the Doc Martens and going to see a lot of bands that would later on become pretty famous. And I was sort of, you know, I was younger. I was kind of living out there in alternative land. And I think these comic books at the time, there was a group of, I don't know, was it a genre, a group, a collection, I don't know exactly how to say it, but there was sort of an influx of, you know, alternative small press comics. And Dark Horse Presents, you know, anthologies, and all anthologies are really sort of good when you're in that mindset, when you're in sort of an experimental mindset and you're open to, you know, reading new stuff or listening to new music or whatever it is, you know, watching new movies. I think anthologies and these types of things where collections get put together and they get sort of tossed in front of you to listen to and sample, you know, those are always good. And I remember Dark Horse Presents was a real strong comic at the time, and it was really good at sort of exposing you to a wide variety of different types of comics and different stories and different, takes on comic books and different illustrative styles and different storytelling styles and whatnot. And I really don't know necessarily that in hindsight, I've gone back at conventions and come home with, stacks of Dark Horse Presents just because of the, I don't know, what do you call it? The reminiscing factor, or the, looking hindsight with rose-colored glasses, or however they say it. But, you look back on those and you think, oh, I remember these were, great books at the time. And arguably I've gone back and, tried to reread a handful of these Dark Horse Presents anthologies. And I don't know that all of them hold up really well, but I do remember there were things like, Frank Miller had some good starts in these. These were sort of the beginnings of, I remember the Aliens books from Dark Horse were a real strong story and real strong books at the time. So I kind of had a soft spot for Dark Horse. I remember, really falling in love with Concrete and really, really loving, all of the Aliens books. I don't think that there was a bad Dark Horse Aliens book probably for, years and years and years. And then, of course, they were the first to team Aliens up with Predators. So Aliens versus Predators got its start in the Dark Horse comics of the early 90s, I think, late 80s, early 90s. They were one of the first to consider licensing books. I remember they had The Mask at the time, which was a really good comic at the time. Later, I don't know, turned into a somewhat okay movie. I mean, I remember it put Jim Carrey on the map and Cameron Diaz, I believe, on the map, but I don't recall it being much of a memorable movie other than sort of like the manic performance from Jim Carrey. But yeah, I mean, Dark Horse Comics, pretty decent little comic imprint. Later on in the mid-90s, I believe, somewhere around the mid-90s, maybe the late 90s, they teamed up with, let's see, who was it? John Byrne, Mike Mignola, Chris Claremont, I believe, and a handful of other people to start Frank Miller, and they started their Legends imprint, which I believe was sort of Dark Horse's answer to the shot that Image fired across the bow. I think, Dark Horse was chugging along there for a long time, putting out pretty decent comics and making a name for themselves. And then, all of a sudden, Image made a huge splash on the scene and kind of eclipsed Dark Horse. And then Malibu quickly got in on the game with the Ultraverse line, and then I believe following that, Dark Horse decided they wanted to do their own kind of superstar or rock star comic creator imprint, and that's when they formed the Legend line. But they did pretty good. I mean, we got Hellboy out of Dark Horse Comics. I'm a huge fan of John Byrne's Next Men, so I love John Byrne's Next Men. But yeah, it was a pretty decent comic book line, and I think it still is to this day. I don't necessarily go out of my way to collect a lot of Dark Horse comics, but boy, they do have a soft spot in my heart. So I think probably this is, if I were to take a look at why I probably haven't gotten rid of these books, it's probably about 75% because it's Dark Horse, which represents sort of still to my mind a little bit of quality, and then probably 25% because of the covers of these books. I love the covers of these 4 issues. It's an interesting story. It was made into a movie that I believe starred Stephen Baldwin, maybe. I think it starred Jamie Lee Curtis, Billy Baldwin, Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Sutherland, William Baldwin. It was, I don't really recall what year it was made, but oh man, was it a flop. It was a bad movie. It was turned into a bad movie. It originally started, from what I understand, the writer Chuck Farrar, Pfarrar, I think you would pronounce that Farrar, Chuck Farrar, and drawn by Howard Cobb and published in 1992. This was originally envisioned as a screenplay, so this plays like a movie, right? It's a 4-issue limited series, and it has, beginning, middle, and end, and it does play like a science fiction horror movie. And I just remember at the time being really smitten with the idea of organic and inorganic hybrid, alien life forms. This is an alien virus that is discovered on an abandoned Chinese research vessel. So, there's a storm out at sea, and when the storm clears, there's this abandoned Chinese research vessel floating out there in the ocean that's discovered by a small crew on another ship, and they, figure that they can take this derelict boat, claim this derelict because there's nobody on board, claim this derelict boat, take it back into port and make a fortune off of the salvage of it or the selling of it or whatever. So initially motivated by a little bit of greed and a little bit of treasure find, it turns into a horror story pretty quickly. But it's a really interesting horror story. I think I personally like the idea of sort of like I said, like the organic and inorganic hybrid. This is an alien life form that starts to sort of assemble itself from pieces of the ship and combines it with, the remains of the human crew. So you get these really wild organic, inorganic life form mashups that are pretty cool. So I think it was probably, it really resonated in terms of sort of like all of the touch points that I kind of dig in terms of science fiction and biology and science and it definitely puts a little bit of the science in science fiction. So I kind of dug it. But it's it's okay. I was getting ready to say it's a great story, and I don't know that I would necessarily go that far. I might call it a decent story. I think it's one of those books that if you have 4 issues and you're sort of waiting for a plane to take off or something, you could probably, blow through it pretty quickly and somewhat enjoy it. And I think the comic book probably plays a heck of a lot better than the movie does. So if you have an opportunity and you're sort of itching for a little bit of, early 90s, late 80s science fiction, a la like The Thing or that type of stuff, then this is probably right up your alley, and I would go ahead and give it a shot. But do yourself a favor. I would definitely recommend that you sort of seek out and look for the covers, because I think the covers of this book are really, really cool. And if you go and run over to comicbookoftheday.com, you can check the cover out of this issue and see sort of what I'm talking about. I really do dig the covers of these books. They're really sort of stark and arresting, and they really sort of jump out at you. And I think that's probably, if this were sitting on a shelf, I think this is definitely something that I would sort of walk by and stop and pick up. And you see sort of one of 4, and you think, all right, I'll invest, $5, $6, $8, $7 into checking this story out. I don't have to. It's not a huge commitment. It doesn't take a whole lot of commitment to get 4 issues and sort of blow through them. So, give it a shot if you're so inclined. The great thing about this is I think this book was $2.50 when it was published in 1992, and Overstreet has it valued at $3 a book. So it's increased a whopping, 50 cents in the last 20 years or so, 20 plus years. So it's definitely something that's on the increase. It's definitely a wise investment if you're looking for some place to put your $3. Maybe in 20, 25 years you could potentially get back $3.50 if you're so inclined to sell it after 20, 25 years. And I might, who knows? I might throw it up on eBay. One day I might need, $12. But go and check it out over on comicbookoftheday.com. You can follow along on Facebook. We are Comic Book of the Day on Facebook. You can tweet at us and follow us on Twitter. We are CB of the Day at Twitter, and we're also on Instagram, Comic Book of the Day. So seek us out, find us, talk to us, give us some recommendations. If you like the podcast, subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, and Google Play. So give it a shot and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening. This is the Comic Book of the Day podcast, and we will see you tomorrow.